Hopefully you were able to watch the other videos and turn in those assignments. Make sure you do. And yeah, so last week we talked about that objective truth or objective reality can exist. I mean, you are listening to this lecture right now. We also talked about ways of knowing something to be true. We have observation of nature, moral systems, experience, accountability, meaning what other people have talked about throughout history, and assent through reason. So how can we use logic and reason to determine conclusions? And those are usually ways that we know something to be true. I also talked about the limitation of language. Oftentimes, a language might describe something with insufficient information, or we might be trying to describe something that we don't have a full picture of, or even experience or understanding of, and so it's limited to often our own experience. An example of that, often used in regards to theology and religion, is this concept of the elephant. And so what happens is that you have a picture of an elephant, and every person just sees a part of the elephant. Some people see the tail, some people see the trunk, some people see the ears, some people see the feet. And each person describes this elephant based on what they see. But it is a very limited version of who the elephant is. Oftentimes that's used as an argument that none of us are really right in terms of our theology, and that we all have a limited picture of the whole thing. Although it might be a limited picture of the whole thing, what it does do is it conveys our commonalities and our differences in terms of theology. And in addition, what it says is that the elephant exists. Not that we are all wrong, we don't have it right, but what it does point to is the fact that this objective reality and objective truth does exist. And in this case, it would be the elephant. We also saw from the video that knowledge is justified belief. I'll write that up. Oops. Knowledge, or when we know something to be true, our knowledge, our experience of knowledge, is equal to a justified true belief. My writing. Okay. Knowledge. Let me see that. There we go. Knowledge is a justified true belief. Okay, so if we believe something, it's not justified, then it wouldn't necessarily be knowledge unless we have the evidence to back it up. Now, the video goes on to clarify for us what justified means. So justified could be evidence. It could be scientific evidence. It could be our observation of evidence. It could be our observation of history, evidence or support to our claim. Now, oftentimes we use the scientific method to create or have that evidence for us to be justified in our belief so that we actually know something. The continued video then talks about how oftentimes what happens is that if we believe something to be true, then we will find the evidence to prove what we believe. Okay, so if I believe that someone tomorrow is going to give me $1 million, then I'm going to look for the evidence to confirm my belief. Because if I look for the evidence to confirm what I believe, and I will find it, they would say knowledge really comes when I try to find the evidence or the support for the opposite view. And so, for example, if I do believe in God, then I'm going to look for the evidence that supports God not existing. I would take that evidence and then figure out the most reasonable explanation for it. Or, if you don't believe in God, take the evidence for God's existence. And does that then confirm our knowledge of our belief that God does exist. And so it would be taking the opposite of whatever we do. Now, we will do this in this class. We will at times assume that God exists. At times we will assume the opposite. God does not exist. And does the evidence show that God does not exist? And so just be aware of that as we go on through this class, that we will take both positions. As we talk about knowledge of God, we will conclude that knowledge is based on the principles through our observation and experience. We did talk about last time how the ways that we can know something, our observation, our experience, and those are justifiable material for our belief. So what happens oftentimes with a Christian theology or belief system is someone would say, well, how do you know God exists, or why do you really believe in Jesus? And I could say, well, I just believe. I just trust it. I just believe. That's what it is. However, we can use our experience and observations to confirm our belief. We don't need to be, as Christians, subject to just the fact that I believe and that's what it is. One of the people that did this is C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is a famous Christian author, writer. He wrote the Narnia books, and so if you've ever seen the Narnia movies, but in this book he writes Mere Christianity. And I included a couple of chapters of this book as part of your reading. It is attached to the email. Make sure you read that. And an excerpt, part of this is what he did is he was an atheist for many years. And being an atheist, he was looking for the evidence to prove that God does not exist. And so he had different arguments, different reasoning for God not existing. Now what happens is as he looked at this evidence of God not existing, what it did is it actually proved to him that God does exist. And part of a quote I want to read that you'll be reading out of this book and out of this section, C.S. Lewis says this: "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it?" Meaning, if he was meant to just be part of the universe, part of creation, why did he find himself revolting against it, or not happy, or finding fault with it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, meaning he was making it up. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancy. So one of his arguments against God's existence is look at creation, look at the world. It looks very unjust. And it being so unjust and being things happening in our world, we have the coronavirus, people are dying, and it seems unjust. God can't exist for a world that is so unjust. And so he says he would have to give up the unjust argument if he is just part of the play, part of the story, as you will. And then he would lose his argument against God, or against God. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole world, the whole reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense, meaning it did make sense. There was a reason he felt like the world was unjust. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never have known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Now you can use this argument, and we will use this argument. We talk next week on proofs for God's existence, which is if there is evil in the world, then and our concept of bad, then good must exist. Then there must be some kind of a divine figure. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a concept of bad. We wouldn't have a concept of evil. It just would be what it is. And so for C.S. Lewis, this led him not to prove God does not exist, but actually as a proof that God does exist. Now, that leads us to this idea that we talked about a little bit last week, which was this knowledge gap between us and God. So I'm going to draw a little thing. You can bear with me here. Normally I have the whiteboard. Draw a little smiley face. We have God up here. Knowledge. Oops. Oh. Okay, good enough. So here we have our guy down there, and we have God way up here. Now there's a gap, and this knowledge gap between this person and God is here. We could say, well, I could study God, I could look for God, I could get really, really close to God. Could I actually have the thoughts that God does? Could I actually think what God thinks? Could I actually understand what God understands? Probably not. Why? Because I'm a finite being. So no matter how much knowledge I have in understanding or trying to seek God, there's going to be a gap, and we can see that gap here. Now this gap is an understanding gap that is created between us and a divine figure. And so with this gap, although there is a gap in our ability to reason out God, and we talked about, well, the solution then, which we will talk about today in special revelation and general revelation. Revelation is a term that is given for basically revealing or communication or God showing himself to the world. And so in order for us to understand God, I can't bridge the gap because I can only come so far. So I am actually dependent on God or the divine essence or being coming down to me, coming down to my level, helping me understand who God is. Now that doesn't mean I don't use my reason. I don't use my own observation or experience as part of that process. I actually do. It just means that I can't bridge the gap. And so here, this idea of God coming to us to reveal something to us about who he is what we call revelation. Now, there are two types of this revelation. All right, sorry for the penmanship. All right, revelation. All right, so God revealing to us who he is. Now, there's two types of this revelation of God revealing to the world. One is called general revelation, the other one specific or special revelation. Now, in general revelation, this is God's communication to all people at all times. Let me write up both of these here. And so this one happens for everybody. That's not working. Okay. So general revelation is God's communication to all people at all times. General revelation is the God revealing himself in the created order or in the world. You could say, well, I saw a beautiful sunset and I reflected on, well, maybe there is a divine presence who is a creator, who enjoys beauty, who established or created all of this. Now, that would be general revelation, my observation of the world or my own experience. As we talked about last week, the observing eye and the observed eye, my ability to self-reflect, to reflect on my own experience, and my ability to be therefore moral. Well, do I like what I did? Is there a good and a bad? Can I become the person I want to be, or have the good life? Now, all of that would be general revelation. It leads us to this general knowledge about God. And so it's our ability to know and think about God. We can logically deduce through reason the existence of God. God didn't need to show himself personally to me for me to take a walk in creation and think about the existence of God. God didn't need to come to me personally and say, hey, I'm here, I exist. I could deduce or reason that a divine figure does exist based on my observation and my experience of life. This observation leads us not to knowing who God is, but knowing that there is a God, knowing that there is a divine being. So it leads us to the existence of God. These observations about God, they're observations about God, about knowing God, knowing about God, and not necessarily knowing God. So the difference there is then when we talked about specific, and I'll give you an example of that. So hold on that for just a second. And usually these observations come from the means that I talked about before about how we know something. So our observations of ourselves, nature, history, the human condition, our experiences of life, all of that adds into our ability to observe that God might exist. And all of that is general revelation. Although this does lead us to an awareness that maybe a divine being does exist, it is limited, right? Because it doesn't show us which God, it doesn't show us who God is, it just leads us to the fact that God may exist. Now, a little bit about this general revelation. So, in a Christian theology, we believe that people have been fallen. They're not complete. There's some limitations on our ability to think and reason. And so the argument for general revelation is that it is a very grace of the divine being to even allow our capacities, our abilities, and so I'll draw something up here. So our ability to, say, love, our ability to reason, our ability to forgive. So we have all of these capacities. Now, normally, in a perfect universe, all of our capacities would actually lead us to not just love, but a perfect version of love, a God or divine version of love. It would lead us to a reasoning or ability to reason that is God-like. We would forgive like God forgives. All of that would lead us to the divine aspect or ability of those things, the perfect entity of those things. But what happens is that we know that with that limitation or that separation between our ability to reason and think like God, that it doesn't. Most of the times our capacities, because they are, I would say, twisted, is that the love comes back usually to ourselves. It doesn't point to God, it actually points to ourselves. And so love points to ourselves. Reason, we reason for ourselves, for our own ability, our own survival. We forgive when it's beneficial to us. We love when it benefits us. When it doesn't benefit us, we have a lot harder time with it. And so oftentimes these God or these human abilities, these human capacities that we're supposed to, in a Christian theology, lead us, well, even outside of a Christian theology, that our capacities are supposed to lead us to if God does and does not exist and who that God is limited. has shortcomings, oftentimes because it comes back to us. And so if we are dependent just on our ability to reason or love or figure out life, oftentimes we might say, well, yeah, maybe God exists. Maybe there is a divine God and a divine being, but I don't know who that is. And I don't think anybody can know who that is. Oftentimes, because we are limited in that, in our ability to think through it, then we will always fall short and it will come back to us. Well, does my belief system benefit me? Now, that's what general revelation does. It is a grace of God that allows us to come up with these things, to reason, to go, yeah, I think God exists, but it doesn't point us to who God is. There is still this separation. Therefore, we need what's called special revelation or specific revelation. And that revelation is God coming to us specifically. Now, again, general revelation is God communicating to all of humanity for all time through all things. Special revelation is God's communication specific to an individual at a particular point in time. That's God coming down and saying, I'm God, the one you've been looking for. It's God showing up and showing us who he is. It's a lot more specific. It's unique. It creates different images of God. And so, as before, I could observe part of the elephant and say, well, I think God's like a tail, and I don't think we all have it right or anybody has it right. When God comes or the elephant says, hey, I'm an elephant, we go, oh, I get it now, right? And so when God comes and reveals who he is, then we can know. This specific in knowing then leads us to attributes of God that are both true of him, but also reflect the language and understanding of us regarding him. We will get into more of that when we talk about the attributes of God. What that's saying is that as God reveals to me, yes, he's going to use language, communication that I understand. So when God says, I love you, I'm going to understand that in my limited version of love. Does God mean just my understanding of the word or the concept? Well, no. God means his understanding of the word or concept. I just don't fully get it yet. So he means both my understanding and a greater version of this understanding, and which are both true about God, right? God says he's love, so it's true about God, and meets me where I am. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the attributes of God. But in special, specific revelation, that's what occurs. These can come through historical events. They can come through divine speech, God saying, here I am, or as Christian theology, we believe in the incarnation, that God actually comes into the world, into the flesh, to talk to us like another person would. This is God's self-presentation. It's not just a presentation of statements. God isn't coming down and just saying, well, here's who I am, A, B, C, D, E. He's coming down and he is saying those things, so they are statements, but they are more than statements. They are actually presentations of a person. Revelation is, because of that revelation, specific, special, is both what we would call propositional. It does have a statement that we can analyze, but it's also personal. When someone says, I love you, that's a statement, it's propositional. However, depending on who says it, it might mean a lot more, right? The person who says it to you, you might go, wow, there's a lot more to those words because it's very personal. In the same regards with God, it's not just a statement, right? I love you. It is a statement, and it's also personal, that reflects the nature of who God is, the divine essence, and who we are in relation to God. Both those things are true when we have this special, specific revelation. Another example of that is that if the difference between general revelation and special revelation, say I were to explain to you and tell you about my friend. I could say, well, my friend is 5'8", has brown hair, very lively, likes people, likes good food. And you could create a picture or understanding of my friend. And you could try to imagine who my friend is. Now, each one of you is going to have a different picture or understanding of my friend. Now, what happens if I invite my friend right here and you meet my friend? Well, then as you meet my friend, you're going to have a totally different understanding. This new understanding, does that mean that the statements I told you about my friend are incorrect? No. The propositional statements of my friend are still true. However, as you meet my friend, you've added more meaning or understanding to who my friend is. And so your understanding goes deeper beyond just the statements. But the statements about my friend are still true. And so your knowledge about the person goes beyond the descriptions. We were talking about this in general and specific revelation. In general revelation, we get ideas or concepts about God. I can tell you about my friend. But when you meet my friend, then you can know my friend. You can know things that maybe you're not able to communicate. You'll be like, yeah, what's that? Your friend is, I don't know. I just, sense something about your friend. So you can sense something. You can experience things that maybe you don't even have words for. And so the difference between knowing about my friend and knowing my friend. Well, the same thing with general revelation and special revelation. I can know about God by observing the world, reading books, studying, asking people. But then there's another step to the knowledge of God, which is knowing God, this personal interaction with the divine being in which our statements, our beliefs, and our knowledge gets clarified in who God is. These are the two aspects of this revelation of God to us, in general and specific. Now, there are certain proofs for God's existence. As we talk next week, we're going to talk about proofs for the existence of God. And so this week we need to create a foundation of this sense of our ability to reason, our ability to come to know who God is, or even think about God. Now, these proofs, some of them will be on both ends. Some of them will be, our reasoning, our ability to look at the world and deduce that there is a divine being, that God does exist. And some of them will be a lot more personal, our personal engagement, our encounter with this person who actually walked into the room, and we got to know this person. And so both of those will be part of this argument. So that is general revelation and special revelation, and our ability to know about God and know God.